as we continue our trip down memory lane through phase 1, we cannot forget about Iron Man. Now, as this was technically the beginning or the kicking off point for the current MCU, we all know that Blade was technically the saving of the MCU, but we understand that the MCU as currently constructed that we understand now was started by Iron Man in 2008. With that in mind, the fanfare that we now come to know and love had not yet been created. So instead, given Marvel title card that we used to see in movies like Daredevil back in 2003, which by the way was given to us on February 14th, 2003. But we open with AC/DC's Back in Black, which by the way, AC/DC is one of, or is the favorite band of one Tony Stark. And this song is actually a foreshadowing of the coming together of everyone back inside of EndGame, back inside of Black, no less, after Tony's death. This opening also foreshadows how Tony will actually also die as well by his own weapon, because the bomb that blows up inside of this sequence that produces the shrapnel inside of Tony's chest was a bomb that was created by Stark Industries, obviously his own company. And similarly, Tony plays a major part in the creation of the makeshift Infinity Gauntlet that we see in EndGame that brings everyone back, and also what Thanos tries to use in EndGame as well. But like I said, this happens to be Tony's favorite band, which makes sense as to why he would be playing this song in a car filled with people that he is unfamiliar with, because it would bring him some sort of peace. And we all understand that he is a narcissist, but he does have a slight soft spot, and he doesn't want everyone to judge him by that narcissism. We then get a close-up on Tony's glass, which we then later find out comes from a case with a bunch of adult beverages, which by the way comes after he gives his presentation on the Jericho missile, which actually happens to be one of the things that ends up getting him captured at the end of the day. But we will talk more about this particular case later on in future videos. If you know where that comes from though, leave down in the comments upside down, because if you know, you know, and leave that as a hint for everyone else. Then in the conversation had between Tony and the soldiers, Tony is asked,
I have a question to ask.
Yes, please.
Is it true you went 12 for 12 with last year's maximum cover models?
which Tony's response is that he actually had to make a shift for March and December because he had a scheduling conflict, and this coincides fairly well with what would actually have happened in a real world situation, because one of the 2007 cover models was Ben Stiller, and there's no way that Tony would have been anywhere close to Ben Stiller. Oh, and as I was editing this, I found out even more information about this particular line, that it is shade towards Christina Aguilera, specifically because of the advances that RDJ was trying to make towards her, and she was always shooting him down. So this line is specifically towards her. Add to this, when asked for a picture and the soldier throws up the peace sign, Tony says in passing, yeah, peace. I would be out of a job with peace, which actually comes as a later foreshadowing or slightly doubling down after he leaves the cave, because he denounces all arms deals after his ordeal inside of the cave, and then later in Age of Ultron he also says
Peace in our time.
Imagine that. And if you don't know, that is also coming from a comic book run where the Hulk, sent in space by Nick Fury, finding out some things that he was not really trying to find out, and makes him very angry in the process. It's also a really ironic situation that he says this, peace in our time, to one Bruce Banner in the MCU. But this quote is also given to us by PM Chamberlain, and in both situations that this is used, the enemy still invades, because in Age of Ultron, where we hear it, Ultron still takes over his systems and overthrows Tony, and after PM Chamberlain actually says this, Germany still invades. And also that MySpace line, do y'all remember MySpace? Maybe not. Okay, I'm old.
Hey, old guys,
Then in the battle that ensues afterwards, we see how Tony's outlook on weapons manufacturing will change, especially once he sees a bomb land in front of him with his own name written on it, as the enemy is actually pummeling the entire area with these bombs in front of him. And if you didn't know, or if you didn't remember, a similar bomb is used in the story of the telling of Wanda's origin story in WandaVision, given by Wanda. And in the next clip of Tony trying to contact someone, it is presumed that he was trying to contact either Obadiah or Rhodey. But at this point, I would be prone to believe that he was leaning towards, or I am leaning towards, Obadiah, because he was the last person to be contacted by phone by Tony. And he's also probably the only person that's still up because of what he says to Tony before he gets into the Humvee. Speaking of Rhodey, fast forward to the award ceremony, we get Terrence Howard as Rhodey gracing the stage inside of a welcoming speech, which is supposed to be for Tony. And as we all know, we see him in this movie and never again inside of the MCU.
Next time, baby.
But later on, when Tony is told by Rhodey to not be late, what he's talking about is actually being late to the private plane going to the arms presentation that he is going to give about the Jericho missile. And if you look closely, as he hands off his award, Tony says a quote from the Bible, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar," as he passes a man who is cosplaying as Caesar in Caesar's palace of all places. And it's been confirmed that this movie did shoot on location inside of this hotel and casino. But the reporter seen later here inside of Iron Man 1 is later mentioned in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, who, by the way, comes from Vanity Fair. And when she asks about one of his nicknames, the Merchant of Death, Tony again brings up the fact that, at least at this part of his life, he believes that peace cannot be gained without weapon. But in this conversation, he also mentions the mentality of his father, because he also believed that without big guns, the other guy would also always have the upper hand on you. But we now know that peace is the only thing that Tony wants in the end, because he actually almost did not go on the time heist because he wanted to keep what he had and his peaceful family and peaceful life, because he had never experienced that up until then. And when Tony mentions the Manhattan Project, this was a real thing and the basis of the movie Oppenheimer, which, by the way, Robert Downey Jr. actually does make an appearance inside of, and Howard Stark is credited with creating or helping to create a nuclear bomb to go against the Nazis in World War II. And after Tony has the conversation with the Vanity Fair reporter and they head back to his place, the bedroom scene is so 2000s, bruh. But the next familiar voice that we hear is the voice of Paul Bettany, who would later become the voice of Jarvis and Vision later on. And during this sequence, we also get our first look at Tony's then Malibu home, which obviously doesn't actually carry through to the rest of the MCU, but it's nice to remember this relic, as it were. But as Pepper attempts to remove Miss Everhart from the premises, you can see a bit of continuity shift inside of the cuts as we shift from one scene to the other. Because when Christine makes a jab at Pepper, she's already holding the dry clean clothes, but when the camera is brought to Pepper's close-up, you can see that she's not actually holding them until later on in the shot. Later on in the conversation that Tony has in his shop with Pepper, we can see the relationship that Tony now has with money, or at least the relationship that he always had with money, which I really wonder where that actually came from, because he can really do whatever he wants, mainly because of what his father set up for him, which seems like large amount of everything type of money. Then Tony says a word that I have to look up.
Please don't harangue me about this stuff.
After Pepper makes a mention about MIT, which I originally thought was an ad-lib. It is a real word. And in the last encounter before leaving out, we can see some budding feelings between the two of them, because as they talk about plans for her birthday, you can kind of see that they're playfully flirting with each other without trying to step over the line too much. Because you can even see it after she takes the cup from him, she pauses just a little bit. Now in this next scene, Happy keeping up with an Audi inside of a Bentley is absolutely unhinged and insane. And Tony's excuse as to why he was late, he got caught doing a piece for Vanity Fair. Yeah, we get it. But later on in the next scene, after Tony gets off of the plane, you can hear him speak to the Afghani general in his native tongue, which again suggests Tony's intellect, because he would be talking to a lot of dignitaries given the line of work that he is currently in. In his weapons demonstration later on though, Tony mentions the Stark Enterprises repulsor technology, which by the way is the same tech that we see in the Iron Man suit. And the irony of the last statement that he makes before firing the missiles is that he actually becomes or ends up inside of a cave himself.
Off the chain, and I personally guarantee you the bad guys won't even want to come out of their caves.
But the Jericho bomb to me feels like it was inspired by the Manhattan Project, which again was around atomic bombs, and based on the type of weapon that it is and the cloud that it produces, it looks fairly similar to what we would know inside of that particular situation as well. The transition that happens between Yinsen doing surgery on Tony and the bomb exploding was probably one of the best transitions I've seen in this particular movie. And yes, I watched it a lot. Because not only do we seamlessly transition into a high pressure environment after an explosion, we also begin to humanize Tony for the first time in this movie. Because up until now, he feels untouchable, or basically something that can't be grasped or grounded. This though grounds him completely. And the group that is known as the 10 Rings, which we later find out are fakes, then ask Tony to create or recreate the Jericho missile, which then leads to Tony seeing his hand in destruction at the ground level, especially after having just witnessed the deaths of American soldiers by these actual weapons that he created himself. And even when they show up in front of Tony for the first time, he questions how these weapons, or how his weapons, got into the hands of his enemy, which by the way, we need to hold off on discussing until further inside the end of the video, because there's a lot to unpack right there. And as a software engineer and tinkerer at heart myself, the list of things that Tony has access to would have made me like a kid in a candy store. Even though given his circumstances, they're not the best, having access to that much technology and that much gadgets in front of you makes a software engineer, and again a hobbyist at heart, smile. Then the camera cuts to the goons that are trying to keep Tony and Yinsen inside the cave. One of them asks, what is Tony actually doing? Which the other responds and says, working, which is a callback back to Obadiah's saying that Tony is always
working.
Tony then leans on the arc reactor technology that he has back in his own lab and builds a mini arc reactor to keep the shrapnel from his heart, which also doubles as a source of power for the prototype Iron Man suit. Also, Tony mentions that his arc reactor could produce up to 3 gigajoules of power, which for context, if you need this could power a car for 14 years, give or take, without shutting it off at all. Oh. And just for some more reference, there's this too. After installing the new arc reactor, Yinsen and Tony play a game of backgammon with a bunch of bolts and nuts taken from the dismantled missile, which a similar moment is given to us inside of the MCU later when Nebula and Tony play a game of paper football after the events of Infinity War. And while Tony and Yinsen play, Tony asks him about his family, which Yinsen responds, I will see them when I leave here, which we now understand that his plan was to leave here without actually leaving the cave, because his family was killed before he was actually captured. Then later on, take a listen to the amount of languages that the 10 Rings, or the makeshift 10 Rings, has inside of its rank.
He's speaking Hungarian. I don't
Speak
Aryan. Okay.
The family question is then turned to Tony, which then reveals that he actually does want a family, and the only person he's really been eyeing for that is Pepper, because he now has the plight of most wealthy folks, all of the things in the world, but no one else to share it with. Though when that question is brought to him, it brings to light that he has been completely selfish in his life, and he now wants to change that. Then, of course, because this is the 2000s, we have to have a bald-headed villain, which actually there are two of them inside of this movie. But after pleading his case, Tony is able to save Jensen from having a red hot coal shoved down his throat, because he mentions that what he's trying to build, or what is trying to be built by them asking for him to build it, because they don't know that he's actually building an Iron Man suit at the moment, what they are trying to build needs to be built by two people. So he needs another set of hands, and if he shoves this down his throat, no more set of hands available. But I have to say this, although I enjoyed the performance by Farhan Tahir, I have to say that this character was lackluster at best, mainly because of the way that it was written for him. It was basically as a throw off, because again, we know that the 10 rings don't actually appear here. Let's fast forward to after Tony's door bomb blows up the 10 ring guys, because I want to get to the power sequence before the actual Iron Man suit gets fully charged. And obviously I paid way too much attention to the code in this sequence, so sorry. You can see that this probably will take some time, because there are a few bugs that need to be figured out from the failed messages that I saw, and one of those messages reads failed due to possibly a long message.
What?
Fam, who made these bash scripts? Then when the stuff hits the fan, Jensen goes out guns blazing trying to buy some time for the Iron Man suit, which then Tony does power up the suit, and he is not holding back any punches, especially when he finds out that his friend has been killed after the plan that they had goes awry. But this genius here has the bright idea, when Tony gets his arm stuck, to shoot at the Iron Man suit, which doesn't bode well for him. Like, my guy, what did you think was going to happen? Then towards the end of this battle, when Jensen tells Tony not to waste his life, that becomes the hero moment, or the hero origin for Tony's arc inside of the MCU. Because up until now, until this moment with Jensen, he hasn't cared about anyone but himself. Now he has to make good on the promise that he makes to his fallen friend. And Tony's response after being shot at 11,000 times is really Terminator-esque, to the point where Tony actually stands and lets them fire at him, then says,
My turn.
And the Tony that we knew before, the sheer playboy narcissist that we have come to understand in the beginning part of this movie, is also being blown up in this same sequence. You can pretty much say that the old Tony goes up in flames, because literally he does. He flies up, because what we see at the press conference is a uniquely different Tony. Unique in the sense that he now has a deeper meaning to the things that he now builds and manufactures, which is why he looks at Pepper differently in this moment as well. And you can hear it in the response he gives to Pepper before the press conference even starts. And listen to what Pepper thought he was going to actually say.
Things I want to do. I want an American cheeseburger, and the other
That's enough of that.
is not what you think. I want you to call for a press conference.
And inside of the beginning of the press conference, we see our first SHIELD agent, Agent Coulson, who is the first SHIELD member to appear on screen inside of the MCU at this point. Now, if you were to watch this in direct chronological order, you would see that Captain Marvel is the next in terms of movies upcoming. And in it, you would understand, or it would explain, why SHIELD is considered a separate division with its own entities that it takes care of in terms of the US government. And Tony's opening line in the press conference here is a key point to understand when watching Civil War, because he doesn't get the opportunity to say bye to his parent.
I never got to say goodbye to my father.
And it's one of the biggest things that comes up later on in that movie. But in the next scene, we get a glimpse of what Howard Stark had been working on, the arc reactor technology. And we also hear the famous Howard Stark line from Obi, ready, fire, aim. And I have to say that it's probably one of the more fitting moments for this era that Mad Money is the main focus in the background at a catastrophic business situation, because talking about the drastic change done inside of Stark Industries by Tony Stark himself after announcing that he is no longer going to make weapons is exactly what would have happened in the early 2000s, and this man would have been forefront talking about everything. But the moment between Pepper and Tony in terms of them playing a bit of Operation when they're trying to remove or change the arc reactor in Tony's chest is slightly a hilarious moment, because she doesn't understand what Operation is, and the fact that Tony does means that he is very much into, or was as a child, into science for a very long time. And I don't know about anyone else, but I always got a kick out of the fact that he talked to Dumb E as if it were a real person, but it's still hilarious, especially when he scolds it and basically tells him, if you douse me again, I'm going to turn you into scrap metal. And then we go through a bunch of flight sequences and tests that fail and make Tony get smacked into walls, which again, never not hilarious. And then we go through a bunch of flight sequences before we finally get a moment we all have been waiting for and get tingles about. Even I still get tingles about it watching for the 1000th time at this point. The first Iron Man flight. And when Jarvis then mentions that there are still terabytes of data that they have to calculate, Tony is like, bruh, let me live. I'm flying now. But that terabytes that they were talking about in that time would actually be petabytes of data in this one. We then get a beautiful transition shot into the modern Iron Man mask, which is different from the original one that we saw in the cave. And then Pepper and Tony finally get that close moment that we, the audience, have been waiting for them to have this entire time, and the kiss that doesn't happen. And then Miss Vanity Fair shows up and shows him attacks that he had no idea about, which then uncovers the fact that Obi has been selling weapons to the enemy this entire time, which then sends Tony into overdrive mode, sending him into his shop to finish the Iron Man suit for the first and final, or the beginning, whatever, time. And in this moment, we get our first successful controlled test of the repulsors that we now have come to love of the Iron Man suit, bringing us to the most iconic scene in this entire movie for me, because I'm an Iron Man fan.
Big whoop, wanna fight about it?
Do me if you want to in the comments. But the most iconic part of this entire movie, the gantry scene. And it's the first time we see this happen in the MCU. Then we see what looks to be the Jericho missile being used, but remember, Tony never finished that. So there's even more proof of Obi sending weapons to the enemy. Then enter Tony stage left, and we then get a call from Rhodey after Tony blows up the Jericho missiles that he again did not sanction, which he told him that he was working on something big, and now this is the thing that he was talking about, which then leads us into a segued press conference in terms of the way that the MCU's military service and everyone inside of the government itself handles everything. Everything is a military exercise or a training exercise in terms of explaining it away. And Pepper is pretty concerned at this point because she did not know or have any idea that Tony was working on something that could withstand bullet holes. And then we get another moment between Pepper and Tony again when she tells him that he is pretty much all that she has as well. But this is another portion of the hero journey that Tony goes on inside of the MCU. But Obi's most iconic line inside of the MCU shows up here.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Now, to make this a little bit clearer and cleaner, let's fast forward just a little bit towards where Obi starts creating his own Iron Man suit. By the way, that looks very similar to the Hydra stopper. We then get the most iconic moment for Terrence Howard in the MCU, where he looks back and says,
Next time, baby.
but we all know that he doesn't get that chance, at least not yet. And inside of the battle between Obi and Tony, we get more product placement for Audi when they go crashing inside of one. Then when Obi cracks Tony's Mach 3 helmet, it's another foreshadowing moment for EndGame because he doesn't have his helmet, and this is also a moment where Pepper ends up pushing the button to overload the arc reactor, which is a slight foreshadowing to the moment where Tony's arc reactor in the end inside of EndGame fizzles out. But something I took note of here, notice at the end, he doesn't want to be with a bunch of women anymore. He only wants to be with Pepper and Rhodey and not a whole lot of people anymore in terms of an entourage at all. Cause Tony now has a different outlook on life and what actually has meaning. And up until this point, Tony never really wanted to have the name Iron Man at all because he never wanted to be in the same realm as a superhero or anything of that nature. Really, all he wanted to do was just be this really famous rich guy that sold weapons to anyone that was able to pay for them. But in the end, he does actually say the superhero mantra, having a girlfriend who knows his secret identity. That would be Pepper Pot. But when you see Rhodey lean in and actually tell him to stick to the cards, he tells him that he is, and then completely 180s and does it, saying that he is Iron Man, and kicks off what we now know as the MCU in terms of what we've come to love. Getting a good understanding of why things played out the way that they do for Tony helps us understand the entirety of the MCU, at least up until EndGame, and then gives us a bit of a frame on what to expect going forward. So to keep this train moving on, go ahead and click this video or somewhere around here if the video has actually been fully produced at this point, because I still could be editing it at this moment. But what you should be watching at this point should be Iron Man 2, and that's right up. And then if none of those things actually happen, well then